Now, when I think back to the excuses my parents used to make, I feel like an idiot. I remember being 12 years old, standing at the top of the staircase and watching all of the people filing into our basement. Some men wore white masks, some women wore bonnets, but they all had small suitcases, as though there was a bus stop beneath our house, and every one of them looked pale, frightened. My mother would catch me watching from above and send me off to bed, but not before I could ask what was happening. "We're just going to talk about grown-up things, baby." Her voice was sweet and high-pitched. She always sounded happy, regardless of how concerned she looked. "One day you will join us too. For right now, though, you should get some sleep." But I didn't sleep. I never could, with the images of those people's blanched faces in my mind, men and women alike, all terrified. I would lie awake in bed with my ear pressed to the mattress, covering the other side of my head with a pillow. From inside my shell, the heavy thudding from below was transformed into the sounds of marshmallows bouncing around. The screams that would follow were instead turned into a murmuring kind of one-note melody. One after another, the unique notes of each person would resound and then die away. My entire childhood consisted of this nightly succession of muffled marshmallows and melodies coming from the invisible bus stop in the basement, and then reality hit. Literally, one day, Manuel came up to me at school and pushed me hard against the lockers. He punched me in the stomach twice before he even said a word. Only when he saw that the teachers were forcing their way through the crowded hall did he ask me, "Why is my mother at your house?" What? I neither knew what his mother looked like, nor where she had been. It was such a weird question, but something inside of me twisted at the thought of the people coming in. I pictured what his mother might look like, her caramel Latina skin looking pale from the terror that would inevitably seize her, because it seized them all. "I'm sorry," I said. "My dad just sits in his room and cries." He bellowed in my face. He punched me again, this time in my face. The teachers were upon us, restraining him. "Where is she?" he yelled, as he was dragged away. "I know she's there, puto. Tell me she's there." I apologized again. "Please, just tell me she's there." His voice was breaking now. He sounded like he was tearing up a little. "Isn't she? Is that where she is? Her name is Gloria. Please, is she okay? Is she?" He couldn't hold it back any longer. The teachers gave him enough room to move, and he instantly pushed his hands over his face, hiding the tears that were coming now. 3 years passed, and I had started getting a reputation. At least I'm guessing that's what happened, because people completely stopped trying to talk to me as soon as I was in high school. Mother explained that people just turn into bad people the older they get. She said that's why, when they get to be full-grown adults, they come to our house to try and fix things. I was just about to ask her again what goes on in the basement, but I stopped myself. I was developing a plan now to infiltrate the basement and finally see for myself. I knew all my parents would say is, "You're not old enough." It always made me feel like I was still a little child, the way they said it. But I was starting to resist. I was starting to crave that feeling that I saw all of the other kids at school expressing. They looked so mature, so grown up. I felt somehow that the only way to get there would be to sneak into the basement while my parents went to the grocery store. Only recently had I found where Dad hid the key to the basement door that was locked from the outside. I had stumbled on a secret drawer in the kitchen when I was looking for a potato peeler. I knew it had to be the key because it had a weird engraving that was identical to tattoos that some of the strangers would have on the backs of their hands. It looked like a snake that was eating its own tail. As soon as the front door swung shut behind them, I launched downstairs and took up the key. I had expected to need a lot of time to rummage around the basement and see what was going on down there, but I expected wrong. The minute I swung the basement door open, I was overcome with the strong, foul smell that I knew could only be the smell of death. There was no light switch on the wall, but I found a flashlight hanging on a peg instead. I flipped the beam on and slowly waded through the stench, down the steps, where the air got colder and colder. I could hear the low sounds of moaning, echoing throughout the subterranean passage. At the base of the stairs, there was only cold concrete and bare steel-looking walls enclosing everything. I stepped on something squishy and lunged forwards, away from it as it spoke. Am I forgiven? The flashlight beam knifed into an emaciated, poor-looking woman with shackles chaining her feet to the floor. Her eyes refracted a silvery kind of liquid, as though she had cataracts in both of her eyes. I said nothing and staggered further in until I saw a low red light glowing around the corner. A hearth was glowing hot at the very end of the basement. It was there that my flashlight fell upon something I could never have imagined. A man, just as withered as the woman chained behind me, was pulling a poker out of the hearth. It was a steel rod with the sign of the serpent on the end, glowing red hot. Forgive me, he whispered to no one. He drove the burning end into his stomach, where it sizzled like water in a grease pan. As he did, he let out a scream that matched those I heard at night. Everything was collapsing on top of me. It was here that they brought their suitcases to stay. This was where they congregated and did what? I couldn't even fathom. A wave of nausea overcame me. I wobbled, almost toppling over myself, before dropping my flashlight and resting my hands on my knees. It was all I could do to keep from vomiting everywhere. As I hunkered down, I noticed a small pool of blood that trailed off to the right. I regained myself as best I could and followed it off to the side of the room. There was a closet, and as I drew nearer, the smell of death and decay became almost unbearable. I reached my hand out to the closet, but something stopped me. Someone else, much stronger, had seized my wrist. I spun around to find my father staring gravely down at me, his face lit from the feeble glow of the hearth. You don't want to see what's in there, he said. He smiled at me a little mysteriously. He seemed so natural in the midst of this chamber of death. What is this place? I asked at last. This place, he said, reaching down to my ankles and latching something metal around me, is your new home for the next 2 years. Apparently, you are ready to be an adult, just like the others. You've proven that by disobeying me. So now you too must find forgiveness. I knew I could not resist. Still, I had too many questions. All of those childhood uncertainties were culminating into this absurd place that reeked of death. I asked him again for a straight answer as he took his time attaching my shackles to a bolt shared by a corpse that lay decaying on the floor. This is hell, he said simply. The knowledge has been handed down to us that God no longer has patience to give those who sin against him. On earth, man runs rampant like a disease. It is now only through suffering in our physical bodies that we may repent. It is only through serving in hell on earth that we may be purged from the eternal fire in death. Atonement must be made. A million objections sprang up in my mind, but somehow, part of me could not resist. A part of me felt that this must be, if only because it came from my father. A part of me knew I deserved this and longed to be nearer the hearth so I could burn the apology into my skin. But I wasn't as lucky as that man who died 2 months later and was taken to the closet in the side of the room with the rest of the bodies. No, I was shackled up next to the withered woman named Gloria, who seemed clueless when I told her that her son was looking for her. "I'm a sinner," was all she said. "I must find forgiveness." I was lucky to have foster parents that cared for me as much as Elaine and Bob Wallace did. I've heard so many horror stories about the things some kids go through in the system, from well-disguised child molesters to abusive couples who treat their pets better than their foster children. The adoption system is definitely riddled with pitfalls. But then, there were those genuinely great people out there, like Bob and Elaine. I was too young then to know what they were saving me from. Too young to appreciate their constant attendance in court to ensure that I would not get transferred to another home. Being unable to take me in as their own for some reason, this was the closest thing to adoption as they could get. I remember often asking about my mother. Along with all of my other uncertainties, there was the lingering question of why I could never see her. I always got the same answer: "You're too young to understand, Luke." As years went by, I started thinking those inevitable thoughts that will infiltrate even the most hardened minds of foster children. I must have done something very bad to make her hate me so much that she doesn't want to be my mother anymore. Why won't she write to me or call me or make any attempt to communicate with me? Does she even remember that she has a son anymore? Sometimes I would vent these frustrations to Uncle Bob, as he liked to be called now. I remember being 10 years old on a fishing trip, just him and me. He let me sit on his knee and steer the Jeep down a snowy road until I almost ran us into a ditch. There was just enough thaw in the Alaskan wilderness of Soldotna to allow a stream to flow freely, teeming with salmon. I still have the 2 pictures of us from the trip. Bob was holding up a small 5-pound salmon and smiling. I was crying my eyes out, holding up a salmon that was longer. Then I was tall, with both hands bracing me under its weight. "What's wrong with my mom?" I asked him on the drive back. He looked at me as hard as he could before having to look back down the road. It was dark out, and the road had been crossed by more than a couple moose already. "Your mother is..." He was evidently reaching for the right words. "She is unwell, son." "Like she's sick?" "Yes, but she's a special kind of sick." He thought a moment longer. "She's always been a little sick, if you ask me. She and I went to high school together. That's how I found out about you. But after you were born, she got worse. Then it was my fault." The thought struck me, but I didn't give voice to it. I had always been certain anyways, so this wasn't much news to me. Bob must have seen something in the look on my face, because he smiled reassuringly and motioned for me to take the wheel again. 5 years later, I was moved to another home. The Wallaces were in court daily for weeks, but in the end, they lost the appeals. I still don't understand the necessity of moving children around like this. Still, at the time, I was too naive to be worried about it. I was just a little heartsick about losing Bob and Elaine. In all honesty, being 15 years old helped a lot, because I was moving into that age where the only thing that really mattered was myself. They threw me a big going-away party, and then I was whisked away into a government-issued Astrovan and headed farther up north to a small city called Palmer. I only left behind one very close friend named Garrett. He was a foster kid too, so we instantly took to understanding each other, although we had a silent agreement amongst ourselves that we wouldn't consider ourselves different from any other kids. But there is definitely something about the system that marks you whether you like it or not. It was from him that my desire to know my biological mother started resurfacing. During one of our long chats on the phone, he told me he met his mother. He said it was a little weird at first, but now he's relieved that it happened. It wasn't long after I was with my new family, the Thompsons, that I found myself yearning to meet my biological mother. Tucker, the husband, was an alcoholic, though he tried to hide it from us. I didn't talk much, so he would be oblivious to my presence around the house, while he took steady nips off a pint he kept in his jacket pocket. Mariette knew too, but she pretended like she didn't. They had a really strange, repressed kind of relationship with each other, which obviously trickled down into a strange, repressed kind of relationship with me. Thus it came to pass that I was treated like the resident ghost. This all encouraged my resolve to finally go out and find my mother. I got a bus ticket back to Soldotna, and they never even noticed I was gone. Garrett was great with computers, so he was able to get all of her information and track her down for me. He met me at the station for moral support before we headed off together to the Serenity House Treatment Center. It was there that a smiling woman in blue led me down a brightly lit hall to a door at the end that stood open. She motioned for us to go in before returning to her station at the front. I found my mother sitting in a chair, looking out the window. Her brown hair was the same dark shade as mine. Every fiber of my being was tingling in a way that I hadn't expected. I couldn't explain why, but I was suddenly very excited to meet her. Garrett urged me forward, and I walked in to announce myself. "Bridget?" She turned towards me, her smile lines reflecting my own, except that her face was more wrinkled from premature aging. I could tell she had once been very beautiful, but something about this place, or whatever ailed her, had robbed her of this beauty years ago. "Hello," she said sweetly. "Who might you be?" "I'm Luke." "Luke? I'm your son." Her face went blank for a moment. She seemed to be pondering some very difficult equation in her head, looking down. When she faced back up, her features were distorted. She was exploding with a sudden fury. "You bastard rapist piece of shit!" she screamed. She flung the chair down as she tore up at me. "You filthy fucking sick bastard! Rape! Rape!" She swung her hands like claws, tearing at my arms. She grappled with me and dropped me to the floor before I could realize what was happening. "You are the bastard son of a rapist, and you two will burn in hell together, you little piece of shit," she screamed, inches from my face. She motioned as though she was about to tear into my neck with her teeth, but before she could, she was wrenched away by Garrett. He locked her arms up behind her head and yanked her away. "Burn in hell, you rapist piece of shit. Burn in hell, both of you," she screamed. The nurses flooded in, some restraining her and others urging us from the room. We were ushered into the lobby and told to wait. Garrett was looking at me, horrified, yet apologetic at the same time. I assured him it wasn't his fault. I knew he was thinking it, so I stopped him before he could apologize. It was no one's fault. No one except for one man, a doctor with a coat as white as his moustache, came down the hall and strolled out into the lobby to meet us. He shook our hands, apologizing profusely. "Luke, I presume?" he asked me. He eyed the scratches on my arms and my neck. "I'm very sorry. Rosie is new here. She really ought not to have let you in, considering the circumstances." "Is it true?" I asked. A sick feeling had taken root in my stomach in the midst of the violence. Beneath the burning wounds was something hurting 10 times worse. "Is it true what she said?" "Yes," he said, looking hard into my eyes. "I'm guessing she finally got to say to you what she has been wanting to say for several years now. Your mother was raped when she was 25, and you are—" He paused, as if looking for the right word. "The outcome." Feeling suddenly lost, I thanked him and walked out with Garrett. The world looked foreign to me now. Though I had grown up in Soldotna, the streets now looked wild and mysterious. Everything had taken on a new blankness, as though devoid of any significance any longer. The sick seedling in my stomach was growing. It was growing through me. When we reached the bus stop, Garrett turned to me. "Just because your dad was sick doesn't mean you—" "I know," I stopped him. "I know that, but so what? You know, that's the least of it all." He thought for a second. "Yeah, man, I know what you mean. I'm sorry." We waited in silence for the bus to come. After I'd boarded and waved goodbye to Garrett, I thought hard for the whole ride home. I know I will not grow up to be evil just because my father was. I know that. But still, I am still the consequence of him. My mother is not my mother. My father is not my father. And even I do not wish to possess my own identity anymore. My daughter Alexis is only 10 years old, but she likes to keep my whiskey glass full for me. If her mother was alive, she would probably scream at the both of us. But she's dead now, so we content ourselves with remembering echoes of her displeasure. Meanwhile, Alexis kneels by my recliner and brushes her doll's blonde hair. "Daddy likes to drink," he tells her doll, "and I like to pour him drinks." The doll's plastic little eyes swivel up to frown at me. No, maybe that's just the alcohol. Dolls can't give the same scornful looks as deceased mothers. Another round of laughter escapes the television, reminding me that the show is funny. Thanks, studio audience. I don't think I would have known otherwise. Outside the windows of our apartment, the city lights glitter like 1,000 little candle flames. Someone has lit them just for me. Another reminder to feel something for the wife I used to know. But all I am reminded of is how many goddamn reminders the world gives us when all we want to do is forget. I want to forget the way Alexa's mother screamed as she fell. Why would she scream? That's not what someone does when they are snuffed out, exhausted. That's not the sound someone makes when they cut their body loose from the tethers of the sky, dropping like a stone into the ocean of sound that is downtown Chicago. The thrum swallowed her whole. No, she begged it to swallow her. "Daddy needs more to drink," says Alexis, laying her doll down. Those plastic, evil little eyes burn into me. I can feel its hot stare searing the flesh off my forehead, warming my skull like a stove warms a pot with brains inside. I can hear the sizzle of my mind. I can hear the thrum of the city, begging for someone else to eat. "Do it, pussy," says the doll. I'm watching her mouth now, but it's not moving a second time. Still, I know that voice by now. A weak little manufactured chirp, like a bird with a voice box. Even when Alexis isn't around to pull the string in her back, the doll speaks to me, do it, weakling. Or do you need the same kind of push you gave your wife? I did not push her over the edge. Somehow my glasses shattered on the floor where Alexis was just standing. But now she is kneeling, nursing her face with both hands. She's crying? I didn't say you did, Papa. I know that. I made you drink, Dad. I thought you wanted another. My hand burns, like I just swatted a volleyball with my palm. But there are no volleyballs anywhere nearby. There's only Alexis, nursing her face and hiding her tears from me. No, that's not right. There's also the doll. You're not fit to be a father, my wife said. She was standing at the kitchen counter, but 2 years ago, not now. How could she be there now? Still, I can hear her voice. It's always scolding, always full of so much judgment. I look over to see the kitchen counter empty. Her golden green eyes are missing from below the ceiling lights. Her slender hands are missing from the cold countertops. Her hair, invisible. Only her voice remains now. She makes you drinks because she knows that's all you love, says the invisible woman, the one who refuses to die. She has quit the world, but she fucking refuses to quit me. Then you hit her. Stop it, I say, because I have to say it. Because if I do not, then no one will. I'm not doing anything, I swear, simpers Alexis from her place on the ground. No, that's not her place. I have to remember that. Her place is with the doll, with a smile on her face. But that is just another illusion, another place in another time that will never be. It can be, says the doll. Somehow she has sat herself up. I've only just realized that I'm still standing. I've only just noticed how tall I am compared to that little doll of hers. Compared to her, I am a giant of a man. She can have her place in the sun if you step aside. Is that what you told her, Mother? I ask, but this time inside my head, where only the doll can hear. Is that how you convinced her to give her soul to the city? Yes. Another burst of laughter pours from the warm glow of the television set. Another witty line I must have missed. Suddenly, the television screen goes black, and I hear a song playing. It's soft at first, barely audible, but it gets louder as the lights begin to dim above me. The whole apartment feels darker. Step aside, says the voice. Let her be warm again. Suddenly, the room is at my back. I can feel the wind picking up through what's left of my hair. I can't see it, but I know it's streaked with gray, whatever has not fallen out already. And I know it's not only my hair that has left me. It is not only my hair that disowns who I am. A car horn peals loud and constant from below. The air is cold on my face, the balcony freezing beneath my feet. I am numb, teetering like a wooden plank about to tip into nothingness. But there is a warmth, just a touch. A golden orb, something soft and heated fills my hand. Please don't, whispers Alexis. She won't look up at my face, not after what I did to her, but her voice is full and embracing, her hand so tiny as it wraps around mine. Come back inside, Daddy. I do not know why, but I follow her back into the dimness of the apartment. What was I even doing there, looking down on the street so far below me? Somehow, it seems a little brighter inside now. The television is playing again, and the soft song that once wafted through the dark has lifted away completely. But the doll is still there, looking up at me. Soon enough, she says to me, scorn burned into her plastic, lifeless eyes. Or is it a voice come from somewhere else, just for me? Soon, it says, soon you will have to leave Alexis and give your life to the city below. She won't be able to save you from yourself forever. I won't blame you if you think this is fiction. So much of what's posted here is believable, but not real. Obviously, it's a stretch for me to expect you to think something as unbelievable as this is real. But I've got to tell someone. And seeing as how I no longer have any friends, that someone is you. I've had a pretty rocky past with alcoholism ever since my freshman year of college, so I tend to be more understanding when it comes to other people's substance abuse problems. I guess that's why I offered one of my lifelong friends a room to crash in when he finally ran out of money and the means of feeding his heroin addiction. He was pretty much burning through any notion of rock bottom. His name was James, and I had known him ever since elementary school. He came from a good family, so I was pretty surprised that he was even in the predicament. For the first week, he was crashing at my place. I checked in on him as much as I could. It wasn't nearly as often as I wanted to, but I had just started a new job, and I was putting in over 60 hours a week. So checking on him pretty much came down to right before work at 9 a.m., and then again right before bedtime at 11 p.m. For the first week, I hadn't gotten much sleep because he was always up, moaning and tossing and turning. It sounded like hell, whatever he was going through. All I could do was bring him soups and water Tylenol. He had asked me for weed, but I haven't had access to that in years. After the first week, though, he started keeping his door locked, all of the time. He barely even replied to me when I would knock and ask him if he was still alive. I didn't know a whole lot about withdrawal, but I knew enough to leave him as much space as he needed and wait it out. So I was satisfied to start each day asking him if he was well, and being met with a grunt as an answer. Then I would leave food by his door and come back from work to find it gone. It sort of became a ritual. I was too geared into work to deviate from the same daily routine. But at the start of the third week, things started getting really weird. First, I started getting something they call sleep paralysis. It's where you wake up from a deep sleep, but are unable to move your body or open your eyes. The first time this happened, I was pretty sure I was about to die or something. Or, secondly, James started pacing in his room, like a lot. His bedroom was converted from my office space, so it was all hardwood floors. Strangely enough, it sounded like he had boots on or something. As I would be drifting off to sleep, I could hear the thud, thud, thud of his shoes on the floor, and yet he still would not unlock his door. And third, after the third week, I started catching slight glimpses of James, as though he was an exotic fucking animal or something. I would come home from work and see him barely slipping back into his room and latching the door shut. Or I would wake up in the middle of the night, after battling sleep paralysis for God knows how long, to see him in the kitchen without any lights on. I would see his eyes like dim lamps floating in the darkness, his hair a mess. I would say hello and go to turn the lights on, but by the time I reached the switches, he would drop whatever he was eating and dash back into his room. But even that wasn't the last straw. The final breaking point for me was when I woke up in the morning to find a large kitchen knife on my bedside dresser, with the tip of the blade pointing right at me. When I found that, I lost my shit and banged on his door until he answered. I was about to kick the door in, but then I heard him throwing up or something, making some kind of awful, regurgitating noise. "Relapsed," he said weakly, in a voice that did not even seem to belong to him. "Sorry. What the fuck does that have to do with the knife on my dresser? Sorry, got high, got high, and stood over my sleeping body with a knife. He started throwing up again and moaning miserably. Even his moaning seemed different from the first week that he had moved in with me. I felt a little bad for him, but then I remembered the whole point of the thing. It was all reaching a point of senselessness. You got high and ruined everything you're supposed to be working towards. I called, banging on his door again. Open this up. You've got to get out. Now. Out of the room? Out of my fucking house. Okay, you relapsed, but the knife was too much. I want you gone by the time I get home from work tonight. Work gave me enough time to cool down before I got home. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was actually relieved to see his shadow hunched over through the drawn curtains. I'm sorry I got so upset, I said through his door. I'm sorry I relapsed. So that night, I cooked steak breakfast burritos, an old favorite we used to love in high school. I didn't remember buying the steak, but I found it in a paper bag in the refrigerator. I left 2 burritos on a plate by his door and told him to eat them whenever he wanted, then went to bed. That night, I had a really bad nightmare about being locked in a room, punctuated with the incessant tapping noise of boots on hardwood floor. Suddenly, I woke up and found myself, once again, unable to move. But this time was a little different. This time, I felt like I had some kind of inexplicable vision of the room, even though my eyes were still closed. I thought I could feel hard, rasping breaths being taken inches away from my head, as if someone was hovering over me, just breathing. Then I felt a sharp stabbing pain in my side. I immediately thought of the knife, but still I could not wake myself. I tried to scream, but my mouth would not open. Thanks for the burritos, whispered the ragged voice that was unlike anyone's I had ever heard. Then it was gone. The inexplicable face hovering over me, the pain in my side, and my paralysis. I opened my eyes to find the room empty. There was no one there. I checked my side and found that I was not being stabbed by anything. It was a little difficult, but I was finally able to fall back asleep. When I woke up the next morning, I found the knife there on the dresser again, except that it was coated with a thin layer of blood along the edge. I scrambled back in my bed, as if withdrawing from some invisible monster, and instinctively checked myself for wounds. But there was nothing on me. I flew out of bed and pounded on James's door harder than ever. I was furious and scared at the same time, filled with this white-hot kind of adrenaline. I pounded on the door more and more, but there was no answer. Still filled with the adrenaline, I started kicking at the door. Still, there was no response. So I turned around with my back to the door, drew my knee up, and slammed my foot into it as hard as I could. Little splinters of wood went bursting away from the frame as the door flung open. Like a brick wall, the sick smell of decay hit me full in the face as I found James's shrunken body lying on the bed. I could tell just by the look and the smell of him that he had been rotting there for what must have been weeks. His fluids were staining into the mattress in an inky black mess. There was a belt lying loose beside him, while his hand was still clutching a syringe. Then it hit me. If James had been dead, then who was living in his bedroom all those weeks? A chill crawled up my spine and left me feeling naked and exposed. Suddenly, I was swiveling around to look over every opening in the house. I was too afraid to move, so I just crouched down and looked frantically from one corner to the next. Finally, I summoned the courage to move again. only to find his bathroom empty and the space beneath his bed empty as well. Methodically, I checked every cupboard and behind every door in the house. I made my way to the kitchen and found that the window was wide open. But as I made my way to the phone to dial for the police, I found a big chunk of meat on the cutting board, dripping blood over the counter and onto the floor. Beside the cutting board was a small piece of paper with a note written in a shaky hand. It read, "Here's another piece of your junkie friend, who seemed to enjoy the first one so much. I did too. Have another round of burritos ready by the time I come by again tonight." What little bile there was in my stomach threatened to come out as my stomach lurched and tied itself into knots. After dry heaving over the sink for what felt like hours, I got to the phone and dialed 911. When the police and the paramedics arrived, they only had to smell James to confirm my suspicions about him having been dead for a while. It took a lot of explaining to convince them that I couldn't have known sooner. Sure enough, when they flipped him over, they found 2 large chunks of meat carved out of his back. Even the police looked like they were going to throw up when I explained the burritos, the bloody knife, and the note to them. I had to take some time off work and move back in with my parents for a while. But sometimes I still get sleep paralysis, and I sometimes hear the breathing over my head. Sometimes I even look outside my window at night, and I can almost see the 2 lamp-like eyes and the messy head of hair that I thought had belonged to my best friend. I have to confess, I love those shows on television about buying storage units and hunting through antiques, looking for something valuable. I've always had a fascination with old things, and it seems like a relatively easy way to make some extra money. I imagined it must be almost like a treasure hunt. I imagined wrong. It wasn't long before my roommate Andrew started taking an interest in the shows too. Soon, we were both strapped into our recliners, watching the screen and hatching plans of our own to get into the second-hand business. What could it hurt to try, right? All we needed was a little extra cash that we wouldn't mind losing if it didn't pan out. Working at the same restaurant made it easier for us to pool our money for the business venture. We've always been partners in our pipe dreams, but this one seemed a little more tangible than our long-standing plan to become rock stars. The only downside was that Andrew had to make child support payments on top of everything else, so saving up fell more upon me than him. "Did you know she doesn't even work now?" he asked. "She just lives with her mother and collects my money." It was 3 days into our savings plan, and we were standing around the service station during a lull in the workday. Andrew had his phone open, looking at his ex-fiancee's social media pages. I had already given up on trying to keep him off it. "Well, at least you didn't marry her," I offered. "Then you would still be getting paranoid about all of the guys she talks to." He frowned and started searching more tenaciously through her profile. She had already blocked him, but he made a fake profile and borrowed mine to see what she was up to. Andrew is the kind of guy that you either accept in full or prepare to get into arguments with. I understand that he doesn't like to be judged, but at the same time, he does a lot of shady things to deserve it. "Hey, look," he said. He held the phone out for me to see. "Someone posted about a storage auction in Lower East Side this weekend. They only have 1 locker, but that place is almost in the ghetto. I bet we could get one for real cheap there, if anyone else even shows up." I told him I agreed, but I wasn't really sure. And that was before everything started getting weird, before we drove by, get a look. but found the neighborhood uninhabited. No, at that moment, I simply thought that we wouldn't find anything worth our money in that locker. Still, I put aside the worries and figured a little experience wouldn't be so bad if it came cheap. Once we did drive by a couple days later, I was certain that we didn't want to spend our money there. The Hold Steady storage complex consisted of one cluster of 6 storage units. The office windows were boarded up, just like most of the houses surrounding it. I knew I was in for an uphill battle with Andrew on this one. "Come on, this will be a waste of money," I pleaded. "I'm all for getting our feet wet, but this is literally like setting fire to a wad of bills." "You don't know how much we'll have to spend," he said. He was still driving around the block, circling the area like a vulture. He stared hard at the units, like he was trying to see through the walls already. "What if we only had to spend $10? Then it would be a waste of $10. "There's no way, man. Besides, we get to look inside first." He looked curiously at me. "Don't we? That's how they do it in the shows." "I don't know." Andrew drove off to get a U-Haul trailer. I knew he was excited because it was still 4 days until we would actually need to use it. He also started working harder than I thought he was capable. And by working hard as a server, I mean that he was smiling more than I thought he could smile, taking ladies' coats and bowing to them. Sometimes his bourgeois farce was so heavy that I felt a little embarrassed by him. After days of excited speculation, Saturday finally rolled around and we met a short, graying man at the padlock gate. We were the only ones there, just as we predicted. Andrew smiled at me as we followed the manager over to unit number 4. He fumbled at the lock, but the key wouldn't work. "Guess you have to get the saw," Andrew said, sounding a little giddy. "That's how they do it on television anyways." The old man grunted. No, it wasn't entirely like the show. Apparently, he wasn't able to find a saw, because he came back carrying a large 2-sided axe and proceeded to beat on the lock for minutes until it finally gave away. He flung the unit door up and stood back, gesturing into it. Damn it, thought. Andrew was right. There were mounds of old stuff in there. A tarp covered a third of it, so that we could only see a few things near the front. It was completely filled. Still, I didn't see anything too valuable on the surface, so I was glad that we didn't have anyone to bid against. "I guess this is yours, my man," Andrew said, grinning over a $10 bill. "I'm feeling generous, so I'll give you all 10. 15, came a stern, acidic voice from behind us. I turned to find a tall, slender woman dressed almost in rags. It looked like her leather coat and stone-washed jeans were the only things she had worn for years. They were covered in filth and coming apart at the seams. But she held herself with a proud carriage, upright and looking directly through us towards the old man. "Hey, what do you want this shit for?" Andrew's temper let her go a little. "Do you even have a place to put it?" 20, I said. "I am the rightful owner of these things. They were entrusted to me in a will, but because my father couldn't even maintain a storage fee or remember where he kept them." 25. Andrew called out 30, but I didn't bat an eye. We were both onto the same scent. This woman knew what was in there, and whatever it was, it must have been valuable. She wouldn't be there if it wasn't. Suddenly, we were digging through our pockets to put everything together. The bidding got real intense around the $1.90 area, which was a relief for us. At least this woman was just as poor as we were. She held on a couple bids longer, but we won out at 100. Although we had picked up on something definitely interesting, it still felt hard letting go of a bill. The woman remained rooted to the spot, longer than was comfortable. We tried avoiding her, but I just couldn't get myself to go sifting through her family's belongings while she was still standing there. Apparently, Andrew couldn't either. "You two," she hissed, "have made a very big mistake." She stepped closer to me, and I looked around to find that the old man had taken his money and scooted off already. Now there was nothing but the quiet, empty ghetto and us. Very big mistake. She turned and she left. There was no sound of a car engine turning over. Nothing. She just vanished on foot around the corner. We stood stuck for a moment longer, but then the excited nervousness was too much to handle. In an instant, we were tearing the top off and putting our hands on everything in sight. Still, as we sifted through and looked, I couldn't help but keep glancing over my shoulder every now and then, expecting to see that woman coming back for us. Andrew and I both agreed it was best to get the stuff loaded up before checking it out more closely at the house. I was skeptical at first about getting the U-Haul attachment before the auction, but now I was glad for Andrew's optimism. We took the light boxes and random junk out before tearing the top off the majority of the stuff in the back of the storage locker. With a quick jerk, I flung the top off, revealing a big cluster of boxes. Excitement soon waned into disappointment as we started lifting them out. They were light as air, obviously empty. One by one, Andrew flung the boxes away in a flurry. Some of them still had packaging beans spraying out onto the concrete. "No fucking way," he shot out between his breathless excavation. "What is this?" Andrew was now holding a long, thin box over his head with both hands. He looked like a weightlifter who just thrust a ton into the air. Who keeps empty boxes under a tarp? But as he spoke, I was still swimming my way through the small cardboard city. Beneath them all, in the far corner, was a small chest. I tried yanking it out, but it must have weighed hundreds of pounds. "Stop complaining and help me with this." Andrew high-stepped through the trash towards me. I didn't have to look to know his reaction. We were both lost in sudden infatuation. Working up a sweat, we both laid hands on an old-style-looking chest, complete with iron straps and a padlock. It was a deep mahogany color and ornate, with mysterious patterns carved into the panels. "Forgot everything else," he said. "This is all we need. We don't even know if it has anything in it. You feel how heavy it is? Old chests are just heavy like that, man." No, I felt something moving around in there. This has something. I can feel it like a magnet, giving me goosebumps like crazy. But I was getting goosebumps from a different sensation. While Andrew marveled at the chest, I felt as though a pair of eyes were glued to us. We were being watched. I was able to urge him into getting everything ready to go right away. It was hard work getting the chest into the back, but we finally managed to get it tucked behind everything else. Besides the chest, there wasn't all that much. Most of the space had been taken up by boxes, for whatever reason, and we left them behind in the locker. As we drove away, I kept looking back, expecting to see the woman rushing back the unit. When we had gone a couple miles, I almost thought I could hear a shriek from behind, but it was probably just the wind. Like the lazy asses we are, we decided to leave everything besides the chest in the U-Haul to be unloaded on a different day. Finally, We had the mysterious promise of treasure, square in the middle of the living room as we sat rocking in our recliners, scrutinizing it in silence. There was only the creak, creak, creak of the old joints in Andrew's recliner. We should finish unloading that U-Haul so we can get it back, I said. Fuck the U-Haul. Andrew, I'll buy the U-Haul with the gold in there. Now there is gold in there. It was always gold in there. You're losing it. Without another word, Andrew got up and marched into the garage, coming back into the room with a ball-peen hammer. I wanted to tell him not to, but it wouldn't matter. His mind was a one-track expressway to imaginary riches. But I knew we were coming up on something really bad. I don't know if it was the woman's voice in my head or the creepy engravings on the chest, but I had a sinking feeling that we should not have had that chest. I noticed it getting dark outside. The shrill cry of metal on metal rang out from Andrew's efforts. Although I had a bad feeling about it, I did not expect the padlock to resist him as well as it did. The banging went on and on till I had to get up and turn the living room lights on. I suddenly felt very aware of the 3 windows open to the darkness outside. In between the striking of his hammer, I heard a knocking sound. He stopped, mid-swing, and exchanged a look with me. I saw a worried expression on his face that must have been mirroring my own. It can't be, he whispered. It can't be her. No, I thought. I like to think I am a very rational man, so I summoned up all of my wits and went with confidence towards the door. Still, I lingered for a moment with my hand on the knob. I opened the door onto a clear front yard. I was able to breathe again. It's not her, I said. Then who is it? I was so worked up over the thought of that woman finding us that I realized if not her, then surely someone must have been knocking. I called out into the night and got no reply. There was only the chirping of crickets. I closed the door and sat back down. Guess it wasn't anyone, I said. Andrew resumed his hammering. We couldn't be bothered with that little mystery. I had not a thought in my mind besides the gnawing need to know what was inside. Then another knocking sound came. Again he stopped, arm poised over his head. This time it was obviously right in front of him. Andrew dropped the hammer and scooted back away from the chest. It was there, within the wooden planks, that the sound was coming from. It was not a gentle knock, as if that would have been any more reasonable, but a resounding thud. It shook the chest from the inside. But how? Andrew stared on in horror as I resumed his position on the floor. I picked his hammer up and held it hard in my grasp, moved by the desperate need to know. Still the knocking went on as I began striking now. What are you doing? Andrew wailed. What the fuck, man? I have to know. I hit it once, twice, 3 times to no avail. What if it's something living? That's exactly why we shouldn't do it, he protested. Oh, come on. It could only be a rabbit or something, I said, possibly more to encourage myself than Andrew. I struck the padlock harder and harder until it started to crack a little. It groaned and buckled under the damage until finally one of the bars gave. Carefully, I slid the lock off and clicked the latch. Wait, Andrew said. A different kind of knocking came. This time, the chest was not moving. Outside, a breeze was picking up, blowing the curtains of our windows into a little dance in the room. The lights above gave a flicker. I started flipping up the chest latch. The knocking came louder. Andrew went to the door to see as it came crashing in, but he was too late. The front door flung open, throwing him down with it, The latch gave away in front of me, and the chest opened. The lights flickered and danced and smiled in their crackling filaments before extinguishing, spilling darkness down into everything around us. I was awash in the void. I opened my mouth to breathe, but the air slithered out instead, like a cool snake writhing from the constraints of my lungs. I was suddenly aware of everything inside of me. My stomach, my heart, my liver, all jerking forth and bobbing me limp like a marionette and pulling strings. My very being danced and reacted wildly to the invisible, penetrating hand of something groping through the darkness. All was strings within me. My breath, still creeping snake-like, was bound with thread throughout my body, so that, as it escaped, even my toes curled by the taut line, pulling me inside to out. I was in the air now. Still, all was black. I can't explain how, but I knew then that I must have been inches from death. My pulse was slowing down to a light pattering in my throat. It was there that everything inside of me seemed to be rising up into, yet there was no resisting that invisible thread strangling me internally. I was certain I would be dead soon. Then bang! A sharp slamming sound came from before me, and I caught hold of my own breathing at last. I descended onto the soft carpet beneath me. My toes unfurled. My organs went numb again, into their usual imperceptions. The strings vanished. The void vanished. With a couple quick flashes, the bulbs were illuminated again, and I could see. "You are very lucky he is still full," came that same acidic voice from earlier. The woman from earlier was before me, on the opposite side of the chest. Her hand clasped the lid of the chest tight, sealing it against the incessant thumping coming from inside the iron bindings. If he hadn't taken my father last year, then he would have devoured you so quickly you never would have known you existed. Some things are better left unsought, boy. She was smiling now, in a sick kind of way. Andrew was grunting and raising himself up behind me. He looked too addled still to comprehend what had happened. In silence, the woman procured a new lock and looped it through the chest latch. Having snapped it shut, she lifted the chest as though it weighed only a couple pounds and left through the open door. Just like that, she was gone. Andrew and I didn't say a word to each other that night. He must have felt the same thing I did, because I was too happy to be moving on my own now to say anything more. Only once have we broached the subject since then, but we felt silly even talking about it aloud. To speak further would be to acknowledge the existence of something beyond all logic. Needless to say, we don't go treasure hunting much anymore. I should have known something was off by the puzzled looks on the police officers' faces as my wife recounted everything that had happened. It was a couple months ago, and I just pulled in from a long day at the office. Tanya had a full glass of wine in her hand, and the officers had notepads out. Our baby girl had been kidnapped right out from under us. I took a seat next to Tanya and tried to comfort her as she started again from the beginning, for my sake. She was vacuuming in the living room in the afternoon and heard the sound of the front door slamming shut. She said the door wasn't locked. It's such a nice neighborhood. Who would think to lock the doors? She went to check and saw a car peeling out of our driveway, the passenger holding something bundled up in blankets. Startled, she rushed upstairs and found the crib empty. "So, let me get this straight," one of the officers started, not able to conceal the incredulity in his voice. "Someone pulled into your driveway, walked through your front door, went straight to the crib room, and took your baby and left. While I was vacuuming, yes, Tanya said. I suddenly felt a little uncomfortable sitting next to her. Still, I knew she would never do something like that. This I tacitly implied to the officers, as I recounted that we had seen a strange car around our house several times before. They would idle out by the street, only to drive away as soon as we approached the windows. And that wasn't enough to make you lock your doors? The same officer asked. Who could imagine something like this happening? She replied. Someone very deranged, I'm sure. With that last insinuating observation, the police departed. Though I was a little ruffled, I could tell by the look on Tanya's face that she was suffering from the loss. Only because enough time has passed can I even relate this in any sensible way. At the time, I was devastated. I immediately took off vacation time, and Isabel's empty room weighed heavily in my heart every time I passed the door. But I soon learned that the whole incident was absolutely crushing Tanya. She kept Bella's baby monitor by her nightstand table, but I knew not where the other one was now. Isabel was only 6 months old. Tanya complained about being handicapped by pregnancy, but after our daughter was born, she seemed happy to have a new role to take on. It helped that being a stay-at-home mom was completely compatible with her line of work. She says what she does is freelance writing. I guess she writes articles and stories for online journals and has a small following on Twitter. Though she didn't complain at the time, I knew this was the other big struggle for her. She was often so exhausted from Bella that she hadn't had time to write like she used to. I thought this would have given her so much to write about, but instead she became obsessed with what had happened, obsessed to the point where she started having auditory hallucinations. I remember the first time it happened. I was reading A Telltale Heart in bed as she started dozing off, only to shoot upright in bed with a distant look on her face. Bella? She cried, staring at the baby monitor. Bella's back. Do you hear her? She's crying. I heard nothing. Tanya shot out of bed and ran to her room, only to come trudging slowly back to bed. She would take the monitor into her hands and cradle it as though it were our baby. How is she still crying if she's not here? She asked me. I was at a loss for words. Being still crushed by what had happened, I was ill-equipped to comfort her out of this. I figured everyone has their own ways of dealing with tragedy, so I let her hang onto her fantasy for as long as it would play out. Unfortunately, her hallucinations were here to stay, and even became a nightly thing. I urged her to write her feelings out in her articles, but she wouldn't budge. Eventually, I got the idea that if I found some stuff she had been writing before we lost Isabel, I could scrape together enough to send it out for her. But what I found there in her most recent file made me feel sick instead of hopeful. The little bit of fire I was rekindling in me went ice cold. I cannot remember the content verbatim, but the majority of it was short enough to be burned into my memory. It read, "It is a bestial thing if you think about it. Procreation, or more accurately, the impulse to procreate. I wish I had thought about it. If I had, I would have asked myself, why? I'm not writing against those with children. Don't get me wrong. If you love children, then more power to you. Rather, I'm against the common mode of thinking that leads people to see procreation as an inevitable part of human existence, because it absolutely is not. It may even be the opposite. Procreation may be the death of the hosts. Procreation may be the sacrifice of those who engage in it. Like me, for instance. As my readers do know, I have not produced anything worthwhile for weeks now. Do you know why? Because there is a little human being that needs my goddamn attention every minute of the day. It may have ended there, or it may have gone on longer, but that was where I stopped reading. I couldn't stomach another word. If I had read those words by some random chance, I would never have been able to guess that they had come from the Tanya I know and love. I even tried convincing myself for a while that she had copied and pasted them from somewhere on the internet. Hopefully, she was plagiarizing the notions, but Google searches yielded no matches. It had to be her. My vacation was ending soon, and I was far from feeling refreshed. The nights continued to be torn open by the tormented agitation of Tanya. All she could do was fidget in bed and mutter things about the baby crying in the monitor. I tried throwing the baby monitor away several times, but Tanya always had it clasped back in her hands as soon as I was gone, cradling it like it was Bella. Though it tormented her, she could not part with it. She just keeps crying, she would say, over and over. Where is she? Why won't she stop crying? Finally, it got to the point where I figured psychiatric help was needed. However, we were never able to make it into any sessions. The whole thing broke open long before that could happen. It was 1 a.m. on the night before I was to go back to work. I tried taking a handful of Benadryl to try and knock myself out for the night. Still, Tanya found some way even to break through that analgesic shell. Her voice sounded like it was coming from miles away, getting closer and closer, like the call of a train. Finally, my eyes opened, and she was standing straight up on the bed, her hair flowing wildly around her face as she stared straight down at me. She was towering up towards the ceiling, a black mass in the night. She deserved it, she yelled. Christ, it shouldn't be this hard if she deserved what was coming to her, because she did it all on purpose. I swear to God, she did it all on purpose. I tried calming her down, but she was unresponsive to anything I was saying. She was mesmerized by the thoughts that had taken control of her. All the while, she kept her hands clasped to her ears. I could only guess this was to drown out the crying she heard forever coming from the baby monitor. She would lay down and go to sleep, and the second a thought would come into my head and my fingers would hit the keyboard, she would wake up and start crying and crying until I got up and walked over to her crib. And as soon as I walked over and reached down to pick her up and rock her back to sleep, she would just stop and smile, she added in a snarling voice. She would just smile, as if to say, in her little undeveloped words, I got you, you rotting bitch. I got you, and there's nothing you can do because you have sacrificed yourself for me, and this is the end for you. Why do you even try hitting those old keys with your old fingers? Why do you even try? That's what she said to me with that little sinister smile. She lost it completely. I knew there was no way around it. I had to call the police, not to take her into custody, but to take her to an insane asylum or a nut house or whatever it is that they call those places now. She lunged off the bed and sprinted into Bella's old room and yelled down into the empty crib until the police arrived. It was all the same stuff as before, but she just kept repeating it, as if she was saying it to the non-existent baby. Fine, she yelled. The same officers from before were following me up the stairs when she came out, throwing her hands up in the air. Fine, you caught me. I knew you would hear the crying too. The officers looked at each other, then to me. I could offer them nothing by way of an explanation. Stop playing stupid. You hear her crying from the backyard. The whole neighborhood hears her crying all night. Fine, I did kill her. I did bury her back there, but she never shut up. Just get her to shut up, please. She held her bony wrists out to the officers. They were both still incredulous, but one laid his hands on the cuffs at his belt. Yes, I killed her. She is in the backyard. Just make her stop. Please, just make her stop crying. I can't stand the crying anymore. I ran down the stairs and flipped the porch lights on. There in the middle of the backyard was a spot of dirt, a deeper brown than the rest of the dirt in the yard. And there, just beside the mound of earth, was the other baby monitor.